At 07:30 hours on the morning of December 7th, 1944, Second Lieutenant Leonard Lomell crouched in a sunken road beside a Catholic cemetery in Bergstein, Germany, watching 130 Rangers prepare to assault a hill that had already killed thousands of American soldiers. Hill 400 rose 1,315 feet above the frozen German countryside. Its steep, 45-degree slopes were covered with dense, evergreen forest. German pillboxes and machine gun nests dotted the hillside, their interlocking fields of fire designed to kill anything that moved across the snow-covered clearing below. Lomell commanded what remained of Company D, 2nd Ranger Battalion. These men were veterans of Pointe du Hoc and Omaha Beach. They had scaled cliffs under fire on D-Day. They had fought through France and Belgium. They had survived 6 months of continuous combat when most infantry officers lasted 2 weeks. Now they faced the strongest position in the German Siegfried Line, and 4 entire American divisions had already failed to take it. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Hürtgen Forest was 50 square miles of hell on earth. Dense woods, steep ravines, and frozen mud made every step a battle. The forest was so thick that tanks couldn't maneuver. Artillery bursts in the trees sent hot metal and wooden splinters raining down on soldiers below. The Germans had fortified every approach, laid thousands of mines, and positioned their defenses to create killing zones that made the hedgerows of Normandy look manageable. The United States First Army needed to clear this forest to reach the Roa River dams. If the Germans destroyed those dams, the resulting flood would delay the Allied advance into Germany by weeks, possibly months. Engineers warned that the flood would spread 1,500 feet wide and 3 feet deep across the entire Corps front. It would halt Patton's advance. It would give Hitler time to regroup. The dams had to be captured intact, and Hill 400 was the key. From the summit of Hill 400, observers could see 15 miles in every direction. They could watch American movements, direct artillery fire, and coordinate counterattacks. The Germans understood this perfectly. They had turned the hill into a fortress, concrete bunkers with walls 6 feet thick, observation posts equipped with range-finding equipment, pre-registered mortar and artillery coordinates covering every square meter of the approaches. The hill dominated the Roa River Valley. Whoever controlled Hill 400 controlled the battle. The United States 9th Infantry Division tried first in September 1944. They spent 3 weeks fighting for 3 kilometers of forest. 4,500 casualties. They never got close to Hill 400. The 28th Infantry Division attacked in November. 6,184 casualties, no ground gained. The 4th Infantry Division tried at the end of November. 6,053 casualties before they were pulled out. The 8th Infantry Division attacked in early December, still no success. Then the 5th Armored Division's Combat Command Reserve tried with tank support. Their infantry was torn apart. The 47th Armored Infantry Battalion barely held the town of Bergstein at the base of Hill 400. They were in no condition to try again. 5,000 American soldiers had tried to take this hill. Their bodies and burned-out tanks littered the approaches. German artillery had pre-registered every route. German machine gunners knew every field of fire. German mortars could drop shells into any foxhole. The hill was a death factory, and everyone knew it. General Walter Weaver, commander of the 8th Infantry Division, knew he needed something different. Regular infantry wasn't working. Armor wasn't working. He needed specialists. He needed Rangers. On December the 6th, Weaver personally requested the 2nd Ranger Battalion from Phi Corps Commander General Leonard Lomell. Lomell approved it. Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight Eisenhower approved it. The Rangers were going to Hill 400. Lieutenant Colonel James Rudder commanded the 2nd Ranger Battalion. Rudder was 34 years old, a former football coach from Texas who had led his men up the cliffs at Pointe du Hoc on D-Day. He was a practical man who understood that courage alone didn't win battles. You needed planning, you needed surprise, and you needed soldiers who refused to quit when everything went wrong. His Rangers fit that description perfectly. But on December 7th, Rudder wouldn't be leading them uphill 400. That same morning, he was transferred to command the 109th Infantry Regiment of the 28th Infantry Division. Major George Williams took command of the Ranger Battalion. The mission remained unchanged. Take Hill 400. Hold it for 24 hours, or until relieved, by any means necessary, to the last man if required. The battalion moved out on the night of December the 6th. They rode in open trucks through freezing rain from their bivouac area near the Belgian border. The trucks couldn't get closer than 6 miles to Bergstein because German artillery controlled the roads. The Rangers detrucked in the village of Kleinhau around 0200 hours and marched the rest of the way on foot through darkness and mud. They passed the wreckage of previous assaults. Burned-out Sherman tanks, their hulls blackened and turrets blown off, abandoned half-tracks with their sides punctured by 88mm shells, jeeps overturned in ditches, equipment scattered everywhere, helmets, rifles, ammunition boxes, ration cans, and bodies. Some had been there for weeks, frozen in the positions where they died. Others were more recent, covered with a thin layer of fresh snow that didn't hide what lay beneath. Lieutenant Bob Edlin of Company A walked his platoon through this graveyard. He encountered an infantry captain from the 112th Regiment who was being relieved. The captain grabbed Edlin's arm and said, "Bob, this is the meanest son of a bitch that you've ever seen in your life up there. I wish you wouldn't go." The infantry that had been holding Bergstein was running, not walking, running to get away from Hill 400. At 0300 hours, Lomell led a reconnaissance patrol toward the hill. He took volunteers from Companies D and F. They moved through the forest in complete darkness, relying on sound and feel to navigate. German patrols were active. The Rangers could hear them moving through the trees, speaking German in low voices, the distinctive sound of their Mauser bolt-action rifles being chambered. Lomell's patrol reached the base of Hill 400 and began climbing. The slope was steep and slippery. Ice covered the rocks. Tree roots jutted out at odd angles. Every step made noise in the frozen undergrowth. They climbed for 20 minutes, moving slowly, stopping frequently to listen. At approximately 300 feet elevation, they encountered German positions. A log bunker with firing ports facing down the slope, machine gun emplacements behind sandbags, trenches connecting the positions, evidence of a well-prepared defense in depth. The patrol marked the locations mentally and withdrew. They returned to the assembly area at 0600 hours and reported their findings to battalion headquarters. The information was reviewed and passed to the assault companies. The plan was finalized. Companies D and F would assault the hill directly, 130 Rangers total. Companies A, B, and C would secure Bergstein and provide mortar support. Company E and the tanks from the 5th Armored Division's Combat Command Reserve would remain in reserve. The plan was simple because complicated plans fell apart under fire. Cross the open field at the base of the hill, climb 1,315 feet of steep frozen terrain, kill or drive off the German defenders, hold the summit against counterattacks. Artillery would support the assault. Lieutenant Howard Kettlehut, a forward observer from the 56th Armored Field Artillery Battalion, would direct fire from a church bell tower in Bergstein. 18 artillery batteries were assigned to support the Rangers. That represented massive firepower, but it had to be used precisely. Too short, and the shells would kill Rangers. Too long, and the shells would be wasted. The Rangers assembled in a sunken road near the Bergstein Cemetery. The road provided some cover from German observation posts on the hill. The men carried standard infantry loads, M1 Garand rifles, Thompson submachine guns, Browning automatic rifles, fragmentation grenades, ammunition, water, rations, no heavy equipment. Speed and violence of action would be their advantages, not firepower. The temperature was below freezing. A cold drizzle had fallen during the night, coating everything with a thin layer of ice. The ground was frozen solid. Digging foxholes would be nearly impossible on top of the hill. The Rangers would have to use existing German positions or find natural cover among the rocks and fallen trees. They all knew what this meant. When the German artillery came, there would be nowhere to hide. At 07:15 hours, the American artillery bombardment began. Shells screamed overhead and impacted on Hill 400, 105mm howitzers, 155mm guns, 240mm howitzers, 8-inch guns. The noise was deafening. The ground shook from the impacts. Smoke and dirt filled the air. Trees on the hillside shattered and fell. The barrage walked up the slope in sections, starting at the base and moving methodically toward the summit. Kettlehut, watching from the church tower, directed the fire with precision. He could see the hill clearly through his field glasses. He could see where the shells were landing. He adjusted based on impact points, walking the barrage exactly where it needed to go. The Germans in their bunkers felt the ground shake. Shells landed close enough that dirt and debris fell through the firing ports. The noise inside the concrete bunkers was overwhelming, but the thick walls held. The Rangers' artillery was doing what it was supposed to do, forcing the Germans to keep their heads down, but it wasn't destroying the positions. At 07:25 hours, the barrage shifted to the top of the hill. The base and lower slopes were now clear. This was the signal. At 07:30 hours exactly, Major Williams gave the order. Companies D and F moved out from the sunken road. 130 Rangers emerged from cover and began crossing the open field toward Hill 400. The field was approximately 400 yards wide, covered with frozen grass and patches of snow. There was no cover, nothing to hide behind, just open ground, under the direct observation of German machine gunners who had been waiting for this moment. The Rangers moved fast, running in a ragged line, spreading out to avoid clustering. Behind them, the Rangers let out war cries, rebel yells, Indian whoops, screams of rage and defiance. The noise was primal, designed to intimidate and to build their own courage for what was coming. Lieutenant Leonard Lomell later described it as a wild chorus that echoed across the frozen field. 130 men acting like a bunch of Indians, yelling like crazy. The Germans heard them coming. Machine gunners scrambled to their firing positions. Mortar teams grabbed shells and prepared to fire. Riflemen checked their Mauser 98s and waited for the Rangers to get closer. The American artillery was still falling on the summit, but the Germans knew the barrage would stop soon. The Rangers would be crossing that field, and when they did, the killing would begin. Private Kenneth Harsh was running beside Lomell when a mortar round hit the ground 10 feet in front of him. The explosion caught Harsh directly. The blast tore his face apart. He dropped instantly, his neck a raw mass of meat and bone. A replacement ranger, new to the battalion, saw Harsh go down and froze. He dropped to the ground and curled into a ball. Lomell didn't stop. He'd seen men break under fire before. Combat turned soldiers into unpredictable creatures. Some fought like lions, some froze. There was no telling which until the moment arrived. German machine guns opened fire, MG-42s, firing at 1,200 rounds per minute. The sound was distinctive, like tearing cloth at high speed. Tracers arced across the field. Snow and frozen dirt kicked up where the bullets impacted. Rangers dropped. Some were hit and went down hard. Others dove for cover in shallow depressions and shell craters from previous assaults. The field became a killing zone exactly as the Germans had designed it. Lieutenant James McBride, commanding Company D, was waving his men forward when a German rifle round hit him in the right buttock. The bullet went through muscle and exited clean. McBride dropped to one knee, cursing. He considered it an insult to be shot in the ass, but he kept shouting orders, urging his Rangers forward, refusing to leave the field until every man had passed his position. Then he hobbled back toward the aid station, blood soaking through his wool trousers. The Rangers reached the base of Hill 400 in less than 2 minutes, 100 yards across open ground, under machine gun and mortar fire. Men were scattered, disorganized, breathing hard from the sprint and the adrenaline. But they'd made it. The tree line provided some cover. The slope itself blocked the fields of fire from the German positions higher up. Now came the hard part, climbing 1,300 feet, while the Germans tried to kill them every step of the way. The Rangers threw fragmentation grenades into the log bunkers at the base. The explosions turned the wooden structures into splinters. Germans who survived the grenades ran up the hill toward the prepared positions higher up. The Rangers followed immediately, not giving the enemy time to reorganize. They scrambled up the 45-degree slope, boots slipping on ice and frozen scree. It was like climbing a playground slide while being shot at. German mortars adjusted their fire. Shells began landing on the slope. Tree bursts were the worst. When an artillery or mortar shell detonated in the branches above, it sent metal fragments and wooden splinters down on everyone below. The forest canopy, which provided concealment, became a weapon. Rangers were hit by shrapnel they never saw coming. The screams of wounded men echoed through the trees. Lomell climbed with Company D on the right side of the assault. His Thompson submachine gun hung from its sling, bouncing against his chest as he grabbed tree roots and rocks to pull himself up. Every few steps he had to stop and find new handholds. The slope was too steep for running. It required constant scrambling, using hands and feet, finding purchase where you could. And all the while, German rifles and machine guns fired down from above. Lieutenant Thomas Rowland of Company F wanted to send out scouts to locate the German positions. He turned to Platoon Sergeant Elrod Petty and ordered him to send out a man. Petty looked at Rowland like he was insane. Send out a scout? In this, waste a ranger? He shook his head. No. Rowland, new to the battalion and not yet understanding how rangers operated, repeated the order. Petty's response was direct. Fuck you, no way. Rowland turned to Staff Sergeant Bill McHugh for support. McHugh shook his head before the lieutenant could speak. No, sir. The Rangers didn't waste men on pointless reconnaissance when the entire company was already advancing. They'd find the German positions by running into them. At approximately 0800 hours, the lead Rangers reached the first major German defensive line. Trenches connected multiple machine gun positions, concrete reinforced bunkers with steel doors, fields of fire overlapping to create kill zones. The Germans had been preparing these positions for months. They knew the terrain, they knew the approaches, they knew where to concentrate their fire. Private William Anderson from Company F was among the first to reach the crest. Anderson was a seasoned ranger who had fought at Pointe du Hoc. He had been broken in rank from sergeant to private for some garrison infraction, but he was still one of the best fighters in the battalion. He reached the summit with Sergeant Petty and Private First Class Cloise Manning. They saw an enemy bunker with steel doors on the crest. The bunker's firing ports were silent. Either the Germans inside were dead from the artillery, or they were waiting. Petty thrust his Browning automatic rifle through an aperture and emptied a 20-round magazine into the bunker. The noise inside that enclosed space would have been catastrophic. Anderson shoved in a couple of fragmentation grenades and dove for cover. The grenades detonated with muffled thumps. Smoke poured out of the firing ports. The steel door burst open and Germans stumbled out, hands raised, coughing and bleeding. 28 prisoners surrendered within the first 10 minutes. By 0835 hours, Companies D and F had taken the crest of Hill 400. Military historian Charles MacDonald would later write that the Rangers moved so swiftly that the Germans were thoroughly cowed. They held the high ground. They had accomplished what 4 divisions and 5,000 soldiers had failed to do. 130 Rangers had taken Hill 400 in just over 1 hour. But Lomell knew the real fight was just beginning. Taking the hill was one thing, holding it against the inevitable German counterattacks would be something else entirely. He looked around at his men. They were exhausted, scattered, disorganized. Officers were wounded or missing. Company D's commander, Captain James McBride, had been shot crossing the field and evacuated. Company F's Lieutenant McClure had a shattered leg from shrapnel. Lieutenant Rowland would be killed later that day. Lomell realized he was the last officer standing on Hill 400. He was in command. He gathered approximately 90 Rangers from both companies. Platoon integrity had been shattered during the assault. Men from Company D were mixed with men from Company F. Sergeants reported to whoever was closest. The unit was held together by shared experience and mutual trust, not by organizational charts. Lomell knew they were too weak to hold a continuous defensive line across the hilltop. There weren't enough men. The summit was too large. He made a tactical decision that would save them all. Lomell sent out 2-man reconnaissance patrols immediately. The patrols moved down the reverse slope to check likely German assembly areas. This was dangerous work. German infantry would be gathering for counterattacks. The patrols could easily be killed or captured, but Lomell needed intelligence. He needed to know where the Germans were building up. He needed to know which direction the attacks would come from. Too weak to defend everywhere, he had to concentrate his limited force at the critical points. The patrols were successful. They reported back with enemy positions, strength estimates, and likely attack routes. Lomell used this information to position his Rangers. He put machine gun teams at key choke points. He positioned BAR teams to provide overlapping fire. He kept a small reserve near the main bunker that could react to threats from any direction. And he made sure Lieutenant Howard Kettlehut, the forward artillery observer, knew exactly where the American positions were so the artillery wouldn't kill Rangers when the German attacks came. The Germans didn't make them wait long. At 0930 hours, German artillery opened fire on Hill 400. The barrage was massive. Shells screamed overhead and impacted across the summit. 105mm guns, 150mm howitzers. The Germans had registered these coordinates weeks earlier. They knew exactly where to aim. The shells landed with devastating accuracy. The tree bursts were catastrophic. When shells detonated in the branches overhead, hot metal fragments and wooden splinters rained down on the Rangers below. There was no warning. You heard the incoming whistle, then the explosion above, then the deadly shower. Men dove into shallow depressions, pressed themselves against fallen logs, crawled into German foxholes. Anything that offered even minimal overhead cover. The barrage lasted 20 minutes. When it finally stopped, the sudden silence was almost worse than the noise. Lomell's ears rang. His head throbbed. He could taste blood in his mouth from the concussion effects. Around him, Rangers emerged from cover slowly, checking themselves for wounds, calling out for medics. The German artillery had done its job. It had pinned the Rangers down, disoriented them, and prepared the hill for the infantry assault that was coming next. Lomell heard the attack before he saw it. Hundreds of boots crunching through frozen undergrowth, German voices shouting orders. The distinctive mechanical sound of MP-40 submachine guns being cocked. He grabbed his Thompson and moved to the forward edge of the defensive position. What he saw made his stomach drop. Over 100 German soldiers in green and mud-colored camouflage battle smocks were swarming up the southeast slope. Fallschirmjägers, Luftwaffe paratroopers, the elite of the elite. Their bayonets were fixed. They were advancing like a wave of ants, covering ground fast, professional soldiers executing a coordinated assault. Lomell screamed for his Rangers to open fire. Thompson submachine guns chattered. M1 Garands cracked. Browning automatic rifles hammered. The Germans took casualties immediately. Bodies fell and tumbled back down the slope, but they kept coming. The paratroopers used the dense forest for cover, moving from tree to tree, coordinating their fire, suppressing the American positions while other elements advanced. The fight devolved into close-quarters combat. 20 yards separated the combatants in some places. Germans threw potato masher grenades that tumbled end over end through the air. Rangers threw fragmentation grenades back. Explosions echoed across the hilltop. Trees splintered. Men screamed. The smell of cordite and blood filled the frozen air. Lomell fired his Thompson until the barrel was almost too hot to touch. 30-round magazines emptied in seconds. He reloaded, fired again, reloaded. The Germans were trying to flank left through a depression in the terrain. Lomell directed a squad to meet them. Hand-to-hand fighting broke out. Rifles were used as clubs. Bayonets were employed. Men grappled and fell, rolling down the icy slope together. Then Lomell called for artillery. He had the battalion radio in his shallow fighting position. He contacted Kettlehut in the church tower and gave coordinates, but the Germans were too close. If the artillery fell short, it would kill Rangers. If it fell long, it would miss the Germans entirely. The margin for error was measured in yards. Lomell made the decision. Call it in anyway. The German assault had to be broken, and artillery was the only weapon that could do it. The shells came 30 seconds later. American 105mm rounds impacted among the German paratroopers. The explosions tore through the assault formation. Bodies were thrown into the air. Survivors scattered, looking for cover. Their attack momentum shattered. Lomell adjusted fire, walking the barrage down the slope, pursuing the retreating Germans with high explosives. The first counterattack broke. The Fallschirmjägers withdrew, leaving their dead on the frozen hillside. The Rangers used the lull to redistribute ammunition and check their wounded. Doc Block, the battalion surgeon, had established an aid station in a partially destroyed bunker. Medics moved across the hilltop under sporadic sniper fire, dragging wounded Rangers back to the aid station. Some wounds were treatable, shrapnel in the arms and legs, bullet wounds through muscle. Others were beyond help. men with sucking chest wounds, men with abdominal trauma. The medics did what they could and moved on to the next casualty. By noon, companies D and F had been reduced to 32 men. 130 Rangers had climbed this hill 5 hours earlier. Now only 32 were still combat effective. The rest were dead, wounded, or missing. Company D's commander was evacuated. Company F's commander was wounded. Lomell was the entire command structure on the crest of Hill 400. The second German counterattack came at mid-afternoon. 150 paratroopers, this time, outnumbering the Rangers nearly 5 to 1. They attacked from the north, using a smokescreen to mask their approach. The Rangers couldn't see them coming until the Germans were within 50 yards. Then they erupted from the smoke, firing burp guns and rifles, throwing grenades, screaming their own battle cries. Platoon Sergeant Ed Secor made a decision that saved the position. He grabbed 2 MP-40 submachine guns from dead German soldiers and charged directly at the attacking formation. His Rangers, inspired or shamed into action, followed him. They met the German assault head-on with such ferocity that the paratroopers hesitated. That moment of hesitation was enough. The Rangers poured fire into the German ranks. Secor emptied both burp guns, dropped them, picked up a rifle, and kept firing. The Germans broke and withdrew. By 1600 hours, the Rangers were down to 25 men. They had no reserves. Every able-bodied Ranger was on the line. The wounded who could still hold a rifle stayed at their positions. Men with shrapnel wounds in their legs sat in foxholes and fired at any German movement they could see. There was no rear area. There was no safe position. The entire hilltop was under fire. Lomell himself had been wounded during the German artillery preparation for the midday attack. Shrapnel hit him in the head, causing a severe concussion. More shrapnel tore into his left arm, rendering it useless. Blood oozed from his ears, nose, and mouth. His left arm hung limp at his side. He could barely see straight. But he stayed at his position, firing his Thompson one-handed, directing artillery fire between bursts, refusing to evacuate. As night fell, the temperature dropped below freezing. The Rangers had no winter clothing beyond their standard wool uniforms. They had no blankets. They couldn't build fires because the light would draw German artillery. They sat in their shallow fighting positions and froze. Some men took turns sleeping while others kept watch. Others simply stayed awake, too cold and too afraid to sleep. The German artillery continued sporadically throughout the night. Random shells would scream in and explode somewhere on the hilltop. It was psychological warfare, preventing rest, maintaining constant terror. Throughout the night, Germans tried to infiltrate through the Ranger positions. Small groups of 2 or 3 paratroopers would creep up the slope in darkness, trying to reach the American bunkers and trenches. The Rangers hit them with short bursts of bar fire and grenades. Bodies accumulated in front of the defensive positions. The smell was terrible. Cordite, blood, evacuated bowels. Death. It permeated everything. Hermann Stein, from Company F, later recalled that by the end of the first night, his company was down to about 6 men. They had a few more down at the base of the hill who couldn't make it to the summit. The survivors stayed out all night in a drizzle that turned to sleet. There was nowhere warm, nowhere dry, nowhere safe. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. On December 8th, the Germans launched their most determined attacks, 5 separate assaults throughout the day, each one preceded by artillery barrages that shook the hill, each one pressed home with professional determination by elite German paratroopers who understood this hill was critical to German defensive plans. At 0930 hours, the third counterattack began. German infantry rushed the Ranger positions using machine guns, burp guns, rifles, and potato masher grenades. Hand-to-hand fighting developed across the hilltop. Some Rangers used bayonets, others fought with rifle butts and entrenching tools. The Germans got within 10 yards of the main bunker before artillery fire from Lieutenant Kettelhut's batteries drove them back. During the morning bombardment, the battalion aid station took a direct hit. Captain Walter Bloch, the battalion surgeon, was killed instantly. Bloch was a pediatrician in civilian life who had volunteered for the Rangers at Fort Dix in 1943. His wife had begged him not to join the paratroopers because it was too dangerous. He joined the Rangers instead. Now, he was dead on a frozen hilltop in Germany, killed while treating wounded men. The 4th and 5th counterattacks came in the afternoon. The Germans were desperate to retake Hill 400. They knew American artillery observers on this summit could direct fire across the entire Roa River Valley. They knew losing this position threatened their defensive plans for the entire sector. They attacked with everything they had. The Rangers held with everything they had left, which wasn't much. Courage, stubbornness, artillery support, and the knowledge that if they broke, they would die on this hill anyway. By nightfall on December 8th, the Rangers were physically and mentally destroyed. They had fought for 40 hours straight. They had repelled 5 major counterattacks and countless smaller probes. They had called in artillery strikes so close that American shells landed within yards of their positions. They had watched their friends die. They had killed more Germans than they could count. And they were still holding Hill 400. Major Williams sent urgent messages to General Weaver requesting reinforcement or relief. Weaver responded that he was trying to free up units, but the entire 8th Infantry Division was engaged. There was nothing immediately available. The Rangers would have to hold. On the night of December 8th, General Weaver finally managed to shuffle units and free up a battalion from the 13th Infantry Regiment. The infantrymen were trucked to Bergstein and began climbing Hill 400 in darkness. They reached the summit around midnight and took over the defensive positions from the exhausted Rangers. The 2nd Ranger Battalion was finally relieved after holding Hill 400 for 40 hours. During that time, Companies D and F suffered 23 killed in action or died of wounds, 86 wounded, and 4 missing. Out of 130 Rangers who assaulted the hill, only a handful walked down under their own power without wounds. The battalion had lost a quarter of its strength, but they had held. The cost extended beyond the Rangers. The Anderson brothers, Jack and William, both died on December 7th. They had transferred to Company F just 5 days earlier, so they could serve together. They were returned home and buried side by side. Sergeant Morel Stinnett bled out in a crevice on the hillside. Private Garney Colden was added to the lengthening casualty list. Leonard Lomell would later say that December 7th, 1944, was his longest and most miserable day on Earth during his past 75 years. Worse than D-Day, worse than Pointe du Hoc, Hill 400 was a death factory, one way or another. They got you. You froze to death, or you got sick, or you got blown to bits. The strategic importance of Hill 400 became clear within days. On December 16, 1944, Germany launched its last major offensive of the war, the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler's plan was to smash through American lines in the Ardennes, retake Antwerp, and split the Allied forces. Hill 400, with its commanding view of the Roa River Valley, would have been critical for observing and directing the German buildup. American artillery observers on the summit detected German movements and directed fire that disrupted enemy preparations in this sector. The hill changed hands one final time. On the last day of the Hürtgen Forest battle, German forces retook Hill 400 from the 13th Infantry Regiment. The United States Army would not seize the hill again until February 1945, but by then, the Battle of the Bulge had failed Bitst. Hitler's last offensive was broken. The war was effectively over. The 2nd Ranger Battalion's sacrifice at Hill 400 exemplified what military historians call junior leadership initiative. When the plan failed and the officers were killed or wounded, sergeants and privates made life or death decisions that saved the mission. Lomell's decision to send out reconnaissance patrols immediately after taking the hill gave him the intelligence he needed to position his tiny force effectively. His judgment under fire, fighting with one useless arm while blood poured from his head wound, kept the Rangers organized when everything was collapsing. Military historian Thomas Taylor praised Lomell's brilliant defense of the hilltop. Too weak to hold everywhere, Lomell had to learn where the Germans were building to attack. He boldly sent out 2-man recon patrols to check likely enemy assembly areas downhill. These patrols were eminently successful. So, Lomell was able to meet each thrust with what little strength he had. Taylor concluded that Hill 400 was saved by brains and bravery at the junior level. Lomell was awarded the Silver Star for his actions at Hill 400, though he didn't receive it until November 9, 2007. The citation read, "Conspicuously leading from the front, Lomell directed the successful defense of the hilltop in the face of a nearly overwhelming German counterattack at midday. During the German bombardment that preceded the attack, Lomell suffered a head concussion and shrapnel wound in his left arm, rendering it useless. Refusing shelter and at risk of his life, with blood oozing from his ears, nose, and mouth, firing his machine gun cradled in his bandaged left arm with his right hand, he continued to lead his men. The delay in recognition was telling. The United States Army was so ashamed of the Hürtgen Forest campaign that they didn't want to acknowledge it for years. The forest consumed 24,000 American casualties for minimal strategic gain. Hill, 400, cost over 5,000 casualties from multiple divisions before the Rangers finally took it. And then the Germans retook it weeks later anyway. But the Rangers who fought there understood something the historians sometimes missed. They didn't fight for strategic objectives or grand strategies. They fought because their brothers beside them were fighting. They held because surrender meant everyone died. They endured because Rangers don't quit. That simple truth sustained them through 40 hours of hell on a frozen German hilltop. In December 1944, Leonard Lomell survived the war. He was wounded a third time during the Battle of the Bulge. He was honorably discharged in December 1945 and attended law school on the GI Bill. He founded his own law firm and practiced until the mid-1980s. He died on March 1st, 2011, at age 91. Historian Stephen Ambrose called him the single individual, other than General Dwight Eisenhower, most responsible for the success of D-Day. The Rangers of the 2nd Ranger Battalion established a standard for elite light infantry that continues today. Their willingness to assault impossible objectives, their refusal to surrender despite overwhelming odds, and their success in missions where entire divisions had failed created the foundation for modern special operations doctrine. The motto, "Rangers lead the way," originated with these men and their actions at places like Pointe du Hoc, Omaha Beach, and Hill 400. In January 2000, the village of Bergstein erected a memorial at the site where the Rangers made their stand. The memorial is a stone monument with a bronze plaque depicting a Ranger firing a machine gun. The inscription is in French and English. It honors the soldiers of the 3rd United States Infantry Division and specifically commemorates Lieutenant Lomell's heroic action on January 26, 1945. The memorial stands in an open field north of Bergstein, where visitors can look south across the clearing toward the village. The view is largely unchanged. The road the Rangers defended still runs through the area. In winter, snow still covers the ground just as it did in December 1944. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.